Star Trek never really dealt with Spock and Picard's greatest tragedy. Few characters in the Star Trek universe loom as large as Spock and Jean-Luc Picard. Both men embody different eras of Starfleet, different philosophies of leadership, and different approaches to logic, emotion, and duty. Spock, the half-Vulcan science officer, was born into a conflict between cultures and spent his life mediating contradictions within himself and the galaxy. Picard, the thoughtful and commanding captain of the Enterprise D and later the Enterprise E, carried the burden of diplomacy, warfare, and personal loss across decades. Yet, for all their individual depth, there is one strange overlap in their stories, an intersection of tragedy that Star Trek itself has never fully dealt with. Despite sharing screen time in Star Trek, The Next Generation and influencing each other across the canon, both Spock and Picard were shaped by devastating personal losses that Star Trek never gave the weight, closure, or emotional aftermath they deserved. In both cases, these tragedies were defining moments, yet they were treated more like stepping stones in larger storylines than the raw wounds they truly were. Let's dive into how Spock and Picard's greatest tragedies mirror each other, why Star Trek glossed over them, and how the franchise might someday confront what it left unresolved. Spock's tragedy, the fall of Vulcan, and the shadow of Romulus. Spock's life was always one of balancing logic and emotion, but late in his story, during the events of Star Trek 2009, Spock Prime experiences the destruction of Romulus, a catastrophe that not only annihilates billions of lives, but also crushes Spock's decades-long mission of reconciliation between Vulcans and Romulans. For Spock, this wasn't just a galactic disaster, it was personal. His entire later career had been devoted to uniting two estranged cultures. He believed he could finally heal the ancient Vulcan-Romulan schism. Instead, he lived long enough to see his dream burned away in a supernova, leaving him stranded in an alternate timeline where Vulcan itself was destroyed. The tragedy here is twofold. One, Romulus destroyed. Spock's mission of peace failed, and billions of Romulans paid the price. Two, Vulcan destroyed in the Kelvin timeline. In trying to save one world, he lost another, creating a paradox of grief where no matter what he did, one half of his heritage was doomed. And yet, Star Trek never gave Spock the chance to grieve in full. We see fragments of his pain in Star Trek 2009 when he tells Kirk that he has lost everything, but the films quickly pivot back to action. Later tie-in comics and fan speculation suggest Spock continued to live with this torment until his death in the Kelvin timeline, but the core franchise never dramatized the full impact of that loss. Picard's tragedy, the loss of his family at Chateau Picard. Jean-Luc Picard's most defining tragedy arrived abruptly in Star Trek: Generations. After the film's first act, Picard receives devastating news. His brother Robert and his young nephew René have died in a fire at the family vineyard in La Barre, France. For Picard, this was catastrophic. He had never married or had children, and his family line, the proud Picards who had lived at Chateau Picard for centuries, was suddenly extinguished. René, in particular, had represented the continuation of that lineage. In TNG's episode Family, Picard's reconciliation with Robert and his bond with René gave him hope for the future beyond his Starfleet career. In Generations, that hope was snatched away without warning. The tragedy here is layered as well. One, the end of the Picard line. Jean-Luc believed the vineyard would endure, passed from father to son, brother to nephew. The fire severed that continuity. Two, personal isolation. With no family left, Picard was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that his life had been too dedicated to duty and not enough to personal connection. And yet, Star Trek never lingered on this pain. Picard is given one scene of grief with Counselor Troi, where he admits to feeling a terrible emptiness. But then the film rushes him into the Nexus storyline, and the death of Robert and René becomes little more than a setup for Picard's final showdown with Saran. The emotional core of this tragedy was left unexplored, resurfacing only briefly decades later in Star Trek: Picard, where echoes of that isolation still haunt him, parallel wounds, legacy, and loss. What makes these tragedies so haunting is how closely they parallel each other. Both Spock and Picard were men consumed by duty, figures who put the needs of the many above their own desires. Both carried immense intellectual and moral weight in their respective generations, and both were confronted with sudden, irreversible losses that struck at the very core of who they were. Spock's wound was about the failure of his mission and the annihilation of a people he sought to save. His tragedy is cosmic, cultural, and civilizational. Picard's wound was about the collapse of his family line and the realization of personal emptiness. His tragedy is intimate, generational, and deeply human. And yet, despite their scale difference, both tragedies share a theme: the failure to preserve legacy. Spock lost the chance to preserve the Vulcan-Romulan legacy of unity. Picard lost the chance to preserve the Picard name and vineyard. In both cases, what remained was duty without lineage, mission without home. It's almost poetic that when the two men met in TNG's Unification two-parter, it was around the very subject of Romulan-Vulcan reconciliation. Picard, acting as the emissary for Spock's father Sarek, became the bridge between Spock and Starfleet. Decades later, their mirrored tragedies would make them kindred spirits, though the franchise never connected those dots. Why Star Trek never dealt with it? There are a few reasons why these tragedies were never fully explored. One, narrative focus on adventure. Star Trek films and shows often prioritize exploration, diplomacy, or action. While tragedy is acknowledged, it's rarely dwelled upon. Star Trek tends to keep grief in the margins, showing resilience rather than wallowing in despair. 2. Timing of events. Spock's tragedy occurred in the Kelvin timeline films, which were focused on rebooting the franchise for a new generation. Picard's tragedy occurred in Generations, a film that had to juggle the handoff between Kirk and Picard. Neither story had the breathing room to linger on deeply personal aftermaths. 3. Character archetypes. Both Spock and Picard are depicted as stoic figures. Spock, as a Vulcan, suppresses emotion by nature. Picard, as a captain, is trained to push through personal grief to command effectively. Ironically, this very stoicism became an excuse for writers not to give them the vulnerability these tragedies warranted. What could have been? Imagine an arc where Picard, after Generations, truly grapples with the loss of his family. He might have questioned his future in Starfleet, considered retirement earlier, or sought surrogate family relationships with his crew. Instead, his grief is compartmentalized, only resurfacing in Picard decades later. Imagine Spock, in the Kelvin timeline or even through flashbacks in Star Trek, Picard articulating the crushing weight of failing Romulus and witnessing Vulcan's destruction. His grief could have deepened the story of Romulan refugees, or been tied into the Federation's uneasy handling of that crisis. Both characters deserve that space to mourn, to reflect, and to show that even the greatest minds and leaders of Starfleet are not immune to personal devastation. A missed opportunity for connection. What's most heartbreaking is that these tragedies could have tied Spock and Picard together in a profound way. Both men struggled with legacy, with the fear that what they had built, or failed to build, would not endure. A later story, perhaps in Star Trek, Picard could have drawn a line from Spock's mission to Picard's vineyard, uniting them across time not only as colleagues but as two men who bore